Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most unexpected places. Sometimes a single act of kindness can change two lives forever. 67-year-old Silas Muir hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 weeks when he wandered into that livestock auction just to escape the storm. He wasn't looking to buy anything, just waiting for the weather to pass. But when he saw that massive scarred dog sitting in the corner, scheduled to be put down for being too wild, something stirred in the old mountain man's heart. Most folks would have walked away from a beast that size, especially one with those kinds of scars. But Silas saw something familiar in those dark eyes. With the last of his gold dust, he bought the animal they called untrainable. What he didn't know was that this dog carried secrets from a blood feud that had been simmering in these Montana mountains for over a decade. Why would someone want this particular animal dead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm that had driven Silas Muir down from his mountain sanctuary was already a memory by the time he reached the weathered gate of his property. Dawn light filtered through the towering pines that surrounded his cabin, casting long shadows. Across the frost-covered meadow, where he'd spent the better part of 15 years learning to live with only his own thoughts for company. His hand-carved walking stick, worn smooth by countless miles of mountain trails, tapped against the wooden steps as he climbed to his porch. The stick had been his companion longer than any living thing, carved from mountain ash during his first winter up here, when the silence had nearly driven him mad, and he'd needed something to do with his hands besides reach for the bottle. Behind him, the massive dog he'd impulsively named Brimstone padded silently through the snow. The animal moved with surprising grace for something that had to weigh close to 140 pounds. His coat was a mix of black and gray that reminded Silas of storm clouds, and those intelligent amber eyes seemed to take in everything. The cabin's defensive position against the mountainside, the cleared fields of fire around the perimeter, the subtle signs that this was the home of a man who'd learned to think tactically about survival. "Well, boy," Silas said, his voice rusty from disuse, "reckon this is home now." The dog's ears pricked forward at the sound, but he maintained his distance. Smart animal. Trust would have to be earned, not given. Silas pushed open the cabin door and stepped into the space that had been his refuge from the world. The main room was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with shelves lined with well-read books and basic supplies. A sturdy oak table sat beneath the single window that faced east toward the valley below. Through that window, on clear days, he could see all the way to Copperstone, the small town that served as the region's reluctant hub of civilization. He'd built this cabin with his own hands during those first angry months after leaving the world. Behind, every log had been felled, stripped, and fitted with the kind of precision that spoke to military training most folks would never suspect in the quiet mountain man who occasionally came to town for supplies. The construction was solid, defensible, and positioned where a man could see trouble coming from miles away. Brimstone hesitated at the threshold, those amber eyes studying the interior with the wariness of an animal that had learned hard lessons. "About trusting in closed spaces." "Your choice," Silas said, settling into his chair by the fireplace. "Door stays open if you want it." While he worked to get the fire started, the cabin had grown cold during his night away. Silas found his mind drifting back to the auction. He'd only gone down there to wait out the storm, maybe pick up some supplies if the weather cleared. The last thing he'd expected was to come home with a companion, especially one that size. The dog had been magnificent, even chained up in that corner, radiating a kind of dignity that the rough men around him had failed to recognize. When that auctioneer had announced the animal was scheduled for destruction, claiming it was too aggressive and untrainable, Silas had seen something different in those intelligent eyes. Not aggression, wariness. the kind of careful watchfulness that came from surviving bad situations through alertness and quick thinking. It reminded him of himself. The fire caught, and warmth began to push back the morning chill. Silas pulled his coffee pot from its hook and began the familiar ritual of brewing the thick, strong coffee that had sustained him through countless dawns in places far from home. The routine was meditative, grounding him in the present moment rather than letting his thoughts drift to darker times. Brimstone had moved closer, though he remained near the open door. The dog's nostrils flared as he took in the scents of the cabin: wood smoke, coffee, gun oil, and the particular smell of a place where a man lived alone with his memories. "You're welcome to some food," Silas offered, pulling a strip of dried venison from his pack. "Can't promise it's what you're used to, but it's honest meat." He tossed the jerky gently toward the dog, careful not to make any sudden movements. Brimstone sniffed the offering carefully before accepting it, his powerful jaws making quick work of the tough meat. That first day passed in careful observation from both sides. Silas went about his normal routines, checking his snares, splitting firewood, maintaining his equipment, while Brimstone explored the immediate area around the cabin. The dog moved with purpose, investigating scent trails and marking territory, with the methodical thoroughness of an animal establishing new boundaries. By afternoon, when Silas settled onto his porch to watch the sun track across the valley, Brimstone had claimed a spot about 20 feet away where he could observe both his new companion and the approaches to their shared territory. It was exactly where Silas would have positioned himself in similar circumstances. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. Both had learned the value of quiet observation, of taking time to assess new situations before committing to action. The mountains taught that kind of patience to those who survived long enough to learn. As the day wore on, Silas found himself studying his new companion with professional interest. The scars were numerous and telling: claw marks from bears or other large predators, what looked like old bite wounds from fights with other dogs, and several that appeared to be from human-made tools. Someone had worked this animal hard, and not always kindly, but there was intelligence in those amber eyes that went beyond basic animal cunning. This was a dog that had been trained for complex tasks, who understood commands and responded to subtle cues. The way he moved suggested familiarity with working around livestock, and his alertness indicated experience with threats both wild and human. Most interesting was his reaction to certain sounds. When a truck rumbled along the distant highway that connected Copperstone to the larger world beyond, Brimstone's ears would swivel toward the sound and his body would tense, not with excitement but with wariness. When the wind carried the scent of other humans up from the valley, the dog would position himself between the source and Silas without being asked. This was an animal that had learned to be protective, but also one that had reason to fear certain kinds of people. As evening approached and the mountain air grew sharp with the promise of frost, Silas made a decision that surprised him. He left the cabin door propped open and laid out an old blanket near the fireplace. "Your choice," he said again, settling into his chair with a cup of coffee and one of the books that helped him pass the long winter evenings. "But if you're staying, might as well be warm." Brimstone spent another hour patrolling the perimeter before finally accepting the invitation. He entered the cabin with careful dignity, inspected the offered blanket thoroughly, and settled down with a sigh that seemed to carry years of accumulated weariness. That night, for the first time in 15 years, Silas Muir fell asleep to the sound of another living creature's breathing. The soft rhythm was oddly comforting, a reminder of shared warmth and mutual protection that he hadn't realized he'd missed until it was there again. When he woke before dawn, as was his habit, Brimstone was already alert and watching him with those intelligent amber eyes. The dog's tail gave a single dignified wag, the first real sign of acceptance Silas had seen. "Morning, boy," he said quietly, and began another day of learning to share his solitude. Outside, the mountain morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant peaks seem close enough to touch. The valley below was still shrouded in mist, but Silas could see the first wisps of smoke rising from chimneys in Copperstone as the town began to wake. It was a view he'd watched through 1,000 mornings, but somehow it looked different now. Less empty, less like the territory of a man who'd given up on human connection, and more like the home of someone who might, just possibly, be ready to care about something again. Brimstone stretched and padded to the door, looking back expectantly. There was work to be done, territory to patrol, and a new partnership to build, one careful step at a time. Silas reached for his walking stick and followed his new companion into the morning light, ready to discover what changes this unexpected bond might bring to their shared mountain sanctuary. 3 days into their cautious partnership, Silas discovered that Brimstone carried more than scars from his past. The revelation came during what should have been a routine grooming session on the cabin's sunny porch. The dog had finally allowed Silas close enough to work through the matted sections of his coat, a sign of growing trust that had taken patience and several offerings of fresh trout from the creek. As Silas worked his fingers through a particularly tangled section behind Brimstone's ears, he felt something that made him pause. Leather, old, cracked, and nearly buried beneath the thick fur, but definitely leather. "Easy, boy," Silas murmured, as Brimstone tensed at the unfamiliar touch. "Let's see what you've been hiding." With careful fingers, he worked the hidden object free. It was a collar, or what remained of one. The leather was dark with age and weather, the metal hardware green with oxidation. But stamped into the leather, still barely visible despite years of wear, were 2 initials, J.H. Silas sat back on his heels, the torn collar resting in his weathered palm. J.H. Those initials sparked a memory. Something from his early years in these mountains, back when he'd still made regular trips to town and paid attention to local gossip. Jake Hartwell. The name came to him with the sharp clarity that accompanied truly significant recollections. Jake Hartwell had been a young rancher, maybe 25 or 26, who'd inherited a spread-up in the high country from his grandfather. Good land, well-watered, with grass that stayed green even in drought years, the kind of place that made other ranchers envious. Jake had died in an accident, along with his wife and infant daughter. Their truck had gone off the mountain road. During a winter storm, maybe 15 years ago now. Silas remembered the talk in town, how folks had shaken their heads and called it a tragedy. Such a young family, they'd said. Such a waste. But if this collar had belonged to Jake Hartwell's, Doug, how had the animal ended up at that livestock auction, scheduled for destruction like an unwanted stray? Brimstone was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes, as if waiting for some kind of recognition. The dog's reaction to having the collar removed was telling. Relief, as if he'd been carrying a burden he was finally free to set down. "This was yours, wasn't it, boy?" Silas said quietly. "Before whatever happened that left you scarred and running wild, you belonged to the Hartwells." The dog's ears pricked forward at the name, and his tail gave a single, uncertain wag. Recognition. Definitely. And something else. Something that looked almost like grief. Silas tucked the collar into his shirt pocket and made a decision that went against 15 years of avoiding other people's problems. He was going to Copperstone to ask some questions. The ride down the mountain took an hour on the old logging road that connected his property to the main highway. Brimstone rode in the back of Silas's ancient pickup truck, alert and watchful as familiar territory passed by the windows. When they reached the outskirts of town, the dog's demeanor changed. He became restless, pacing from one side of the truck bed to the other, nose working to process scents that clearly held meaning for him. Copperstone hadn't changed much in the months since Silas's last supply run. The main street still consisted of 2 blocks of weathered storefronts, anchored by Murphy's General Store on one end and the Copper Creek Saloon on the other. The post office, bank and diner filled the spaces between, creating the kind of small-town commercial district that had served ranching communities for over a century. Silas parked in front of the diner and rolled the truck windows partway down. For Brimstone's comfort, the dog had settled into a crouch, alert but no longer pacing. Those amber eyes tracked every person who passed on the sidewalk with the intensity of an animal processing important information. The Mountain View Diner was exactly the kind of place where local information flowed as freely as the coffee. Silas pushed through the front door and immediately regretted his decision. Every conversation stopped as heads turned toward the stranger who rarely came to town and never stayed long enough for social interaction. "Well, I'll be damned," called out Bill Murphy from behind the counter. "Silas Muir in the flesh. Haven't seen you since spring. Coffee, please." Silas settled onto a stool and accepted the steaming mug that appeared before him. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly as he remembered. "That your dog out there in the truck?" asked Sarah Winters, the diner's owner and Copperstone's unofficial. "Information clearinghouse. Big fellow. Looks like he's got some wolf in him." "Could be," Silas acknowledged. "Picked him up at the livestock auction down in Deer Lodge. Figured he needed a home." "Auction, you say?" Bill Murphy leaned against the counter with the pose of a man settling in for a good story. "They don't usually handle dogs down there. Must have been some special circumstances." This was exactly the opening Silas had hoped for. Small-town curiosity was a tool he could use. "Auctioneer said the animal was untrainable, scheduled to be put down, but he looked intelligent enough to me." "Big dogs like that," Sarah offered. "They sometimes come from the ranches up in the high country, working animals that got separated from their herds. Or maybe their owners had some kind of trouble." "Speaking of ranch trouble," Bill said, his voice taking on the tone that meant he was about to share significant gossip. "You remember the Hartwell place, up on Copper Creek?" Silas kept his expression neutral. "Vaguely. Thought that family died in an accident some years back." "That's right. Jake and Maria Hartwell, along with their little girl. Winter of 2008, I think it was. Truck went off the road during a blizzard. By the time anyone found them, it was too late." Bill shook his head. "Jake was a good man. Hard worker, fair dealer. Had that place running smooth as silk." "What happened to the ranch?" Silas asked. "Well now, that's where things get interesting," Sarah said, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "The Hartwell place bordered the Morrison spread. Been some bad blood between those families going back to Jake's grandfather. Old territorial disputes, water rights, that kind of thing. After the accident," Bill continued, "turns out Jake had some significant debts. Bank had to sell the property to cover them. Morrison bought the whole spread at auction, got it for maybe 60 cents on the dollar." Silas absorbed this information while staring into his coffee. The timing was suspicious, though he'd learned long ago that suspicious timing didn't necessarily mean conspiracy. Sometimes tragedy was just tragedy, and opportunists were simply quick to capitalize on misfortune. "Jake have a dog?" he asked, casually. "Oh, sure," Sarah said immediately. "Big cattle dog, part German shepherd, part something wild-looking. Called him Rex, I think. That dog could move a herd better than most cowboys. Jake trained him from a pup." "What happened to the dog after the accident?" Bill and Sarah exchanged glances. "You know, that's a good question," Bill said slowly. "Don't recall anyone mentioning the dog. Figured maybe he died with the family or ran off into the wilderness. Wild country up there. Lot of things can happen to a dog on his own, but not death," Silas thought. Not if that dog was sitting in his truck right now, 15 years older and carrying scars from a lifetime of survival. "The Morrison family still around?" he asked. "Oh, sure. Chet Morrison runs the biggest cattle operation in 3 counties now. Got his sons working with him, Tom and Eddie. They've expanded quite a bit since they acquired the Hartwell land." Bill's tone was carefully neutral, the kind of diplomatic silence that spoke volumes in small communities. Silas finished his coffee and left enough money on the counter to cover the drink and a generous tip. "Appreciate the conversation," he said, standing to leave. "You take care of that big dog," Sarah called after him. "He looks like he's seen some hard times. Probably just needs a good home and some patience." Outside, Brimstone was standing in the truck bed, his attention focused on something down the street. Following the dog's gaze, Silas saw a large pickup truck with Morrison Ranch painted on the side. Two men stood beside it, talking in low voices. One was older, maybe 60, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. The other was younger, probably in his 30s, with the soft look of someone who'd inherited rather than earned his position. As Silas watched, both men turned toward his truck, the older man's eyes fixed on Brimstone with an intensity that made the dog's hackles rise. Even from 50 yards away, Silas could see the recognition in the man's face, and something else, something that looked very much like alarm. The two men climbed into their truck and drove away without approaching, but not before the older man pulled out a cell phone and made a brief call. As they passed Silas's parked vehicle, Brimstone let out a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. The dog remembered them, and they certainly remembered the dog. Silas climbed behind the wheel and started the engine, his mind racing with new questions. If Brimstone was Jake Hartwell's cattle dog Rex, how had he survived 15 years in the wilderness? Who had brought him to that auction, and why had they wanted him destroyed rather than simply abandoned? Most importantly, why had the sight of him caused such obvious concern in men who should have been strangers? As they drove back toward the mountain, Silas found himself checking the rearview mirror more frequently than usual. The torn leather collar in his pocket felt heavier than its physical weight could account for, as if it carried the accumulated weight of years of unanswered questions. Beside him, Brimstone rode with his head out the window, tasting the mountain air. But his ears remained alert, and those amber eyes kept scanning their back trail as if expecting pursuit. Whatever secrets this dog carried, Silas realized, there were people who very much wanted those secrets to stay buried. The questions that had begun with a torn collar multiplied like ripples in still water over the following days. Silas found himself making a second trip to town within a week, something he hadn't done in over 3 years. This time to the small building that housed both the post office and Copperstone's informal historical society. Betty Clearwater had been the town's postmaster for 37 years and its unofficial keeper of records for even longer. If anyone would have photographs or documents from the Hartwell era, it would be Betty. She looked up from her sorting when Silas entered, her weathered face creasing into a smile of genuine surprise. "Silas Muir, twice in 1 week. Are you feeling well?" Her tone was teasing but kind. Betty had always been one of the few townspeople who didn't treat his reclusiveness as either mysterious or suspicious. "Research project," he said simply. "Trying to piece together some local history. The Hartwell family that used to ranch up on Copper Creek." Betty's expression grew more serious. "That's a sad story. What brings it to mind?" Rather than explain about Brimstone, Silas offered a partial truth. "Found some old items up on the mountain. Thought they might have belonged to the family. Wanted to see if I could return them to any surviving relatives." "Jake and Maria had no surviving family that I know of," Betty said, moving toward a filing cabinet that had probably been installed during the Eisenhower administration. "But I do have some materials from back then. The county did a feature story on young ranchers in 2007. Jake was included." She pulled out a manila folder that had seen better decades and opened it on the counter between them. Inside were newspaper clippings, a few official documents, and several photographs that had been carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. The first photograph made Silas's breath catch. It showed a young man in his mid-20s standing beside a modest ranch house with mountains rising behind him. Jake Hartwell had the kind of honest face that inspired trust. Clear eyes, steady smile, the bearing of someone comfortable with. Hard work and honest dealing. Beside him stood a young woman holding a toddler, and at their feet sat a dog that was unmistakably a younger version of Brimstone. "That's Rex," Betty said, noticing Silas's focus on the animal. "Jake trained that dog from a puppy. Folks said he was the smartest cattle dog in 3 counties. Could move a herd with just a whistle and hand signals." Silas studied the photograph more carefully. The dog in the picture had the same intelligent amber eyes, the same dignified bearing, but his coat was unmarred by scars, and his expression held the confidence of an animal that had never known betrayal or abandonment. "The accident," Silas said carefully. "What exactly happened?" Betty's expression darkened. "Winter storm in February 2008. Jake was driving his family down to town for supplies when their truck went off Dead Man's Curve. You know that stretch of road? No guardrails, straight drop into the canyon. They found the wreckage 3 days later when the storm cleared. Anyone see the accident happen?" "No, it was during the worst of the blizzard. Nobody else was fool enough to be out on the roads that night." Betty paused, then lowered her voice. "Though there were some folks who wondered why Jake would risk driving in weather like that. He was mountain-born, knew those roads better than anyone. Wasn't like him to take chances with his family in the truck." This was the kind of detail that stuck in Silas's mind. In his experience, good men didn't suddenly start making fatal errors in judgment without compelling reasons. Did he have enemies? Anyone who might have wished him harm? Betty glanced around the empty post office, then leaned closer. There'd been some tension with the Morrison family, old disputes over grazing rights and water access. But enemies? She shook her head. Jake wasn't the type to make real enemies. He was the kind of man who'd rather compromise than fight. "What about after the accident? I heard Morrison acquired the Hartwell property." "That's right. Jake had borrowed heavily to improve the ranch. New fencing, upgraded irrigation, better breeding stock. When he died, Maria's life insurance wasn't enough to cover the debts. The bank foreclosed within 6 months. Betty's tone carried the disapproval of someone who'd watched too many family ranches disappear over the years. Morrison bought it at auction. He was the only bidder, paid exactly what was owed to the bank, not a penny more. Betty closed the folder, but not before Silas had memorized the details of the photograph. "Got himself a prime piece of ranch land for maybe half what it was worth." Silas thanked Betty and left the post office with more questions than answers. The timing of Jake's death, combined with Morrison's immediate acquisition of the coveted property, created a pattern that his military-trained mind recognized as potentially significant. But pattern wasn't proof, and suspicious timing wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. On the drive back up the mountain, Brimstone rode with unusual restlessness. The dog seemed to recognize the route they were taking, his head turning towards specific landmarks with the kind of focused attention that suggested memory rather than mere curiosity. When they passed the turnoff that led to what had once been Hartwell property, Brimstone began pacing in the truck bed, whining softly. "You remember, don't you, boy?" Silas said quietly. "You remember the way home." That evening, as they settled into their routine by the fireplace, Silas found himself studying his companion with new understanding. This wasn't just an abandoned dog he'd rescued from destruction. This was a survivor who had lived through tragedy and somehow endured 15 years in the wilderness, carrying memories of a lost family and a home that no longer existed. The implications were sobering. If Brimstone had survived the accident that killed the Hartwells, what had he witnessed? And why, after all these years, had someone decided he needed to be destroyed rather than simply relocated? As if sensing Silas's thoughts, Brimstone rose from his place by the fire and padded over to where his rescuer sat reading. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, the dog rested his massive head on Silas's knee, a gesture of trust and perhaps gratitude that carried more weight than words could have expressed. "We're going to figure this out," Silas promised, his weathered hand finding the soft spot behind the dog's ears. "Whatever happened to your family, whatever you've been carrying all these years, we're going to find the truth." Outside, The mountain wind carried the sense of coming winter through the pine boughs. But inside the warm cabin, two survivors who had found each other in the darkness began to plan their search for justice, not knowing that their investigation had already attracted the attention of people who had spent 15 years believing their secrets were safely buried with the Hartwell family. In town, phones were ringing, and quiet conversations were being held about the hermit who'd been asking too many questions about ancient history, and about the dog that should have died long ago, but somehow hadn't. The hunt for truth was about to become a hunt for survival. The breakthrough came when Brimstone began leading Silas to places the dog remembered from his former life. 3 days after their visit to town, the animals started displaying behavior that went beyond simple exploration of their mountain territory. He would stand at the edge of their property line, looking northeast toward the high country, whining softly, with an intensity that spoke of urgent need rather than casual desire. "You want to go up there, don't you, boy?" Silas said, following the dog's gaze toward the distant peaks where the Hartwell ranch had once operated. "You want to go home." The next morning, Silas loaded his pack with supplies for a day hike and followed Brimstone into the wilderness. The dog moved with purpose now, following trails that existed more in memory than in physical reality. 15 years of weather and neglect had erased most human traces from the landscape, but Brimstone navigated the terrain as if he'd walked these paths yesterday. They climbed steadily through stands of lodgepole pine and across meadows where wildflowers had reclaimed what had once been cleared grazing land. The air grew thinner as they gained elevation, and Silas found himself grateful for the years of mountain living that had kept him in better shape than most men approaching 70. After 2 hours of hiking, Brimstone stopped at what appeared to be an unremarkable grove of aspen trees. But as Silas looked more closely, he began to see the subtle signs of human habitation: foundation stones overgrown with moss, the geometric lines of what had once been fence posts, a depression in the earth that might have been a root cellar. "This is it, isn't it?" Silas said quietly. "This is where you used to live." Brimstone was moving through the ruins with increasing agitation, his nose working to process scents that had long since faded. He stopped at what had been the front door of a modest cabin and began digging at the earth with his powerful claws, whining with frustration. Silas knelt beside the dog and began helping with the excavation. About 18 inches down, his fingers encountered something that didn't belong in mountain soil, the corner of what felt like a metal container. Working together, they uncovered a rusted ammunition box that had been wrapped in oiled canvas for protection. The container was locked, but the mechanism had corroded enough that Silas was able to force it open with his knife. Inside, preserved in plastic bags, were documents that made his blood run cold. Jake Hartwell's diary, the final entries dated just days before his death. Silas settled against a fallen log and began reading, with Brimstone pressed close against his side, as if the dog understood the significance of what they'd discovered. February 10th, 2008. Morrison's boys came by again today, Tom and Eddie making their usual threats about water rights and property boundaries, getting bolder about it too. Tom actually put his hand on his gun when I told him we weren't selling. Maria's scared, and I don't blame her. These aren't the kind of men who take no for an answer. February 12th, 2008. Found 3 of my steers shot and left to rot in the north pasture. No doubt who's responsible, but can't prove it. Sheriff Coleman won't do anything, says it could have been hunters or predators. Hell, Coleman's been in Morrison's pocket since he got elected. Need to think about what to do. Can't let them intimidate my family, but can't fight the whole Morrison clan either. February 14th, 2008. Decided to take Rex and ride the boundary line one more time. Want to document everything before I make my decision about what to do next. If something happens to me, at least there'll be a record, hidden this box where Rex knows to find it. That dog's smarter than most people. If anyone can lead someone back here someday, it's him. The final entry was dated February 15, 2008. The day before the accident, Rex has been acting strange all day, pacing, whining, watching the approaches. To the ranch, like he's expecting trouble. That dog has instincts about danger that have saved my life more than once. Maria wants us to leave. Go stay in town until things calm down. Maybe she's right. Maybe running away is the smart thing to do. But this land belonged to my grandfather and his father before him. I'll be damned if I let the Morrisons steal it. Through fear and intimidation, if anything happens to us, whoever finds this needs to know the truth. The Morrisons have been trying to force us off this land for 2 years. They've killed our cattle, sabotaged our equipment, and threatened my family. Sheriff Coleman is either bought or intimidated. Either way, he won't help. The bank's been pressuring us too, calling in loans that aren't due and refusing extensions they've given other ranchers without question. I think they mean to kill us. God help me, I think that's what it's come to, but I won't run. This is my daughter's inheritance, and I won't let them take it from her. The diary ended there, but there were other documents in the box. Photographs of dead cattle, copies of threatening, letters, bank correspondence that showed loan terms being arbitrarily changed, a systematic campaign of harassment designed to drive the Hartwells off their land. And at the bottom of the box, a letter addressed to whoever finds this, in Jake. Hartwell's careful handwriting. If you're reading this, then Rex led you here and something's happened to my family. The dog knows where to find this cash because I trained him to. If we disappeared or died in an accident, look to the Morrison family. They've been trying to get our land for years, and they've made it clear they'll do whatever it takes. Rex is the smartest dog I've ever known. He's been with me since he was 6 weeks old, and he's saved my life more times than I can count. If he survived whatever happened to us, he's been living wild all these years, waiting for someone to care enough to listen to what he's trying to tell them. Take care of him. He deserves better than what this world has given him. Silas closed the diary and sat in silence for a long time, absorbing the implications of what he'd read. This wasn't speculation or suspicious timing. This was documented evidence of a conspiracy to murder a family for their land. Brimstone was watching him, with those intelligent amber eyes, as if waiting for some response to the revelations his memory and instincts had helped uncover. "You've been carrying this all these years, haven't you, boy?" Silas said softly, waiting for someone to understand what you were trying to tell them. The dog's tail wagged once, a gesture that carried the weight of 15 years of patient loyalty to a murdered family. As they prepared to hike back down the mountain with their explosive discovery, Silas found himself thinking like a soldier again for the first time in years. This evidence could reopen the case, expose the conspiracy, and bring justice for the Hartwell family. But it would also make him and Brimstone targets for people who had already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. The war he'd thought he'd left behind was about to come home to his mountain sanctuary. The sheriff's badge felt cold and heavy in Silas's weathered palm as he studied it in the lamplight of his cabin. He'd found it tucked behind Jake Hartwell's diary in the ammunition box, a tarnished piece of metal that told its own dark story about corruption and complicity in murder. Sheriff Coleman. The name had appeared repeatedly in Jake's final diary. Entries as someone who refused to investigate the Morrisons' harassment campaign. Now Silas understood why. The badge bore Coleman's name and the date 1995, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had chosen to look the other way when powerful ranchers decided to solve their problems with violence. According to Betty, Clearwater's records, Coleman had died of a heart attack in 2015, taking his secrets to the grave. But the badge Jake had somehow obtained suggested the young rancher had discovered concrete evidence of the sheriff's corruption before his death. Brimstone lay by the fireplace, but his posture remained alert despite the late hour. The dog had been restless since their return from the mountain, as if he understood that their discovery had moved them into dangerous territory. Those intelligent amber eyes tracked every sound outside the cabin, and his ears swiveled constantly toward the approaches to their sanctuary. Silas had spent hours poring over Jake's evidence, piece by piece building a picture of systematic intimidation that had escalated into murder. The documents revealed a conspiracy that went beyond simple land grabbing. The Morrison family had been expanding their holdings throughout the region for decades, using a combination of legal pressure, financial manipulation, and outright violence to force smaller ranchers off valuable properties. The Hartwell Ranch hadn't been their first acquisition, just their most brutal. Bank records showed that Morrison had purchased 7 different properties over the past 20 years, all at below-market prices following the accidental deaths or financial ruin of their previous owners. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked closely enough, but apparently no one in authority had bothered to connect the dots. Until now, the sound of a truck engine grinding up his access road brought both man and dog to immediate alertness. It was past midnight. No time for legitimate visitors to be calling on a mountain hermit. Silas moved to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept propped beside his chair. 2 vehicles were making their way slowly up the narrow track, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough for intimidation, but far enough away to avoid being trapped if things went badly. 4 men climbed out, and even in the darkness, Silas could see they were armed. The older man who seemed to be their leader was broad-shouldered and moved with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Even from a distance, Silas recognized the bearing and build from their brief encounter in town. Chet Morrison had come calling. "Muir!" Morrison's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "We need to talk. Come on out where we can see you." Silas checked his rifle and moved to the cabin door, but didn't open it. "It's late for social calls, Morrison. State your business and get off my land." "Your land, maybe. But you've got something that belongs to us. That dog of yours has been causing some problems." Brimstone had moved to stand beside Silas, his massive frame rigid with tension. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, not the warning sound of a domestic dog, but something more primal and dangerous. "Dog's mine," Silas called back. "Bought him fair and square at auction. Got the paperwork to prove it. That animal's been living wild up here for years, killing livestock and causing trouble for honest ranchers. Should have been put down long ago." Morrison's voice carried the practiced authority of a man who expected his version of events to be accepted without question. "We're prepared to compensate you for your loss, but that beast needs to be destroyed." The offer of compensation told Silas everything he needed to know. These men weren't here about livestock predation or property damage. They were here because they'd recognized Brimstone in town and understood the threat he represented. "Not interested," Silas replied. "Dog stays with me." There was a moment of silence, then Morrison's voice took on a harder edge. "You don't understand the situation, old man. That animal is dangerous. We've got reports of attacks, property damage, threats to public safety. The county's authorized us to deal with the problem." "Funny thing about county authorization," Silas said. "It usually comes with paperwork and badges. All I see out here are 4 armed men on private property in the middle of the night." One of the younger men, probably one of Morrison's sons, took a step forward. "Maybe we should just take the damn dog and be done with it." "Eddie, shut up," Morrison snapped, confirming Silas's guess about family relationships. "We're trying to handle this civilized." But the mask was slipping now. The pretense of legitimate authority was giving way to the raw intimidation that had served the Morrison family for decades. "Last chance, Muir," Morrison called. "Bring the dog out, take your money, and this ends peacefully. Otherwise, things might get unpleasant for you up here on this lonely mountain." Silas felt something shift inside him, a familiar sensation he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The tactical awareness that had kept him alive in hostile territory was reasserting itself, cataloguing threats and calculating responses. These men had made a fundamental miscalculation. They'd assumed they were dealing with an aging hermit who would be easily intimidated by superior numbers and firepower. They had no idea they'd just threatened a former army ranger who'd spent 3 decades learning how to kill people more dangerous than they were. "Morrison!" Silas called, his voice carrying a new quality that made all 4 men shift uneasily. "I'm going to give you one chance to leave my property peacefully. After that, I start treating you like hostile combatants on my territory." There was something in his tone, a cold professionalism that suggested violence was a tool he'd wielded with precision before, that gave even Morrison pause. "This isn't over, old man," Morrison finally said. "That dog's a menace. And one way or another, we're going to deal with it." "Come back with proper authority," Silas replied, "or don't come back at all." The 4 men climbed back into their vehicles and drove away, but not before Morrison made a gesture toward the cabin that looked suspiciously like someone sighting down a rifle barrel. As the sound of engines faded into the distance, Silas found himself thinking tactically for the first time in years. His cabin was defensible but not impregnable. His supplies were adequate for a siege, but not unlimited. Most importantly, he was no longer just protecting himself. He had Brimstone to consider, and the dog represented the only living witness to a 15-year-old murder. The war was no longer theoretical. It had come to his mountain, and like it or not, he was back in the business of staying alive against people who wanted him dead. Beside him, Brimstone pressed close, as if sensing the change in his human companion. The dog's amber eyes held an understanding that transcended species. They were in this together now, 2 survivors against enemies who had already proven their willingness to kill. The battle for truth and justice was about to become a battle for survival. The blood-stained bandana seemed to pulse with significance in the morning light as Silas held it carefully between his fingers. He'd found it wrapped in oiled cloth at the bottom of Jake Hartwell's evidence cache, and the dark brown stains that covered one corner told a story that forensic science could confirm even after 15 years. This wasn't just evidence of harassment or intimidation. This was physical proof of violence. Blood that could belong to Jake, Maria, their infant daughter, or even Rex himself, from that terrible night when a family had been murdered for refusing to surrender their birthright. Brimstone sat beside him on the cabin porch, his amber eyes fixed on the fabric with an intensity that suggested recognition. The dog's reaction to the bandana was different from his response to the other artifacts they'd discovered. This one caused him visible distress, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow as if he were reliving a traumatic memory. "You remember this, don't you, boy?" Silas said gently, tucking the bandana back into its protective wrapping. "You saw who wore this that night." The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his thoughts, but this time the engine note was different, lighter, less aggressive than the trucks that had brought Morrison's men in the darkness. Silas moved to where he could observe the access road while remaining concealed, his rifle within easy reach. A silver SUV with government plates was making its way carefully up the mountain track. The driver appeared to be alone, and when the vehicle stopped near his cabin, a woman in her 30s stepped out. She wore practical hiking boots, jeans, and a jacket that couldn't quite conceal the weapon holstered at her hip. Her movements had the purposeful efficiency of law enforcement, but her approach was cautious rather than aggressive. "Mr. Muir?" she called, staying beside her vehicle with her hands visible. "I'm Sarah Chen, Special Investigator with the Bureau of Land Management. I'd like to speak with you about some irregularities in local property transfers." Silas studied her for a long moment before stepping into view. Something about her bearing suggested competence and integrity, qualities that had been notably absent in local law enforcement for the past 15 years. "What kind of irregularities?" he asked, keeping his distance but lowering his rifle. "The kind that involve federal grazing permits, water rights, and properties that seem to change hands." under questionable circumstances. Sarah's voice was professional, but carried an undertone of genuine concern. I understand you've been asking questions about the Hartwell family. That information could only have come from people in town, which meant Sarah Chen had been investigating the Morrison acquisitions long enough to establish local contacts. The fact that she'd come alone suggested either confidence in her abilities or a deliberate attempt to avoid spooking a potentially valuable witness. Brimstone had emerged from the cabin and now stood beside Silas, studying the newcomer with his usual careful assessment. After a moment, the dog's tail gave a single wag, the first sign of acceptance he'd shown toward any stranger since arriving at the mountain sanctuary. "Your dog has good instincts," Sarah observed. "Mind if I come up to the porch? I have some things to show you that I think you'll find interesting." Silas nodded, and Sarah approached with the kind of measured movements that respected both his wariness and Brimstone's protective instincts. She settled onto the porch steps and opened a briefcase that contained folders, maps, and photographs. "I've been investigating questionable land transfers throughout this region for the past 8 months, she began, spreading documents across the wooden planks. "The Morrison family has acquired over 40,000 acres in the past 20 years, always at below-market prices following suspicious circumstances." The maps showed the scope of Morrison's expansion, a systematic acquisition of prime ranch land that had consolidated what had once been a collection of family spreads into a single massive operation. Red pins marked properties where the previous owners had died in accidents or been forced into bankruptcy before selling. The pattern became obvious once I started looking at it systematically, Sarah continued. But what wasn't obvious was how they were arranging these convenient tragedies. Until I started hearing about a hermit who'd rescued a dog from a livestock auction. A dog that someone was very eager to see destroyed. She pulled out a photograph that made Silas's breath catch. It showed a younger Rex sitting beside Jake, Hartwell's truck, but what was significant was the background. The truck was parked at the edge of what appeared to be Dead Man's Curve, the section of mountain road where the Hartwell family had supposedly died in an accident. "This photograph was taken 3 days before the family died," Sarah said. "It was in Jake Hartwell's insurance file. Notice anything interesting about the truck's condition?" Silas studied the image more carefully. The truck appeared to be in perfect mechanical condition, no visible damage, good tires, no signs of the mechanical failure that might lead to a fatal accident in winter weather. "Now look at this," Sarah said, producing another photograph. This one showed the wreckage after it had been pulled from the canyon. The truck was thoroughly destroyed, but the pattern of damage was wrong. Instead of the crushing impact expected from a vehicle that had rolled down a steep slope, there were sharp, localized areas of destruction that suggested the truck had been deliberately damaged before being pushed over the edge. The local sheriff ruled it an accident caused by driver error in dangerous weather conditions, Sarah continued. But the physical evidence tells a different story. This truck was sabotaged, and the family was probably dead before it went over the cliff. Brimstone had moved closer during this explanation, his attention focused on the photographs with the intensity of an animal recognizing familiar scenes. When Sarah showed the image of the wreckage, the dog whined softly and pressed against Silas's leg. "He was there," Silas said quietly. "He saw what happened. That's what I believe," Sarah agreed. "And that's why someone's been trying to find him and have him destroyed. Rex is the only living witness to the Hartwell murders." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out one final item, a plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be fabric fibers. "I found these caught on a tree branch near the accident site," she said. "The lab identified them as coming from a bandana made of specific cotton blend that was discontinued in 2007. If we could find the actual bandana these fibers came from, it might provide the DNA evidence needed to reopen the case." Silas felt the weight of Jake Hartwell's carefully preserved evidence in his shirt pocket. The blood-stained bandana they'd discovered that morning might be exactly what Sarah Chen needed to bring the Morrison family to justice. But sharing that evidence would also mean acknowledging that he and Brimstone had been conducting their own investigation, which would make them officially valuable witnesses in a federal case. That kind of visibility came with both protection and danger. Protection from federal resources, but danger from people who had already proven their willingness to kill, to keep their secrets buried. What would you need to make a case? He asked carefully. Physical evidence, witness testimony, someone willing to come forward with information about the conspiracy. Sarah's eyes met his directly. Someone who might have discovered things that local law enforcement chose to ignore 15 years ago. The moment of decision had arrived. Silas could continue living in isolation, keeping Jake Hartwell's secrets buried and hoping the Morrison family would leave him and Brimstone alone. Or he could step forward with evidence that might finally bring justice for a murdered family, knowing that doing so would paint a target on his back for the second time in his life. Brimstone was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes, as if waiting for his human partner to make the choice that would honor the memory of the family the dog had loved and lost. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Some fights were worth the risk, and some truths were too important to keep buried. There are some things you need to see, Silas said, reaching into his pocket for the blood-stained bandana that might finally give Jake Hartwell's family the justice they'd been denied for 15 years. Sarah Chen's expression changed dramatically as she examined Silas's military service record on her laptop screen. The official document she'd pulled from federal databases told a story that transformed everything she thought she knew about the quiet mountain hermit who'd been living off the grid for 15 years. Sergeant First Class Silas Muir, 75th Ranger. Regiment, she read aloud, her voice filled with new respect. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. She looked up at him with eyes that now held professional assessment rather than casual interest. You're not just any hermit, are you? Silas had known this moment would come once he decided to cooperate with federal authorities. Background. Checks were routine for anyone becoming a witness in major criminal investigations, but seeing his military service laid out in black and white brought back memories he'd spent 15 years trying to suppress. Was a soldier, he said quietly. Long time ago. According to this, you specialized in asymmetric warfare and deep reconnaissance. Your unit conducted classified operations that are still redacted. Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard, accessing files that revealed more than Silas was comfortable sharing. Your call sign was Ghost. You were decorated for actions that officially never happened. Brimstone seemed to sense his human companion's discomfort with this unwelcome attention to his past. The dog moved closer, pressing his massive frame against Silas's leg in a gesture of support that transcended species. Why did you leave the service? Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she might already know the answer. Got tired of war, Silas replied, which was true enough without being complete. Sarah pulled up another file, this one from Veterans Affairs. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Medical discharge after a classified incident in 2009. Her expression softened. You came up here to heal, came up here to disappear, Silas corrected. Healing was secondary, but Sarah's discovery of his military background had implications that extended far beyond personal history. As she worked through the ramifications, her expression grew troubled. The Morrison family has been operating with impunity for decades because they've never encountered serious resistance, she said slowly. Local law enforcement was either corrupt or intimidated. Federal agencies had no reason to investigate what appeared to be routine property transfers. But now they're dealing with someone who knows how to fight back, Silas finished. That's exactly right, and that changes everything about how they'll respond to the threat you represent. Sarah closed her laptop and leaned forward. Silas, these people have been content to use intimidation and occasional violence because it's been effective against ranchers and local officials. But if they realize they're facing a decorated Army Ranger with advanced combat training, they'll escalate, Silas said, understanding immediately. They'll stop playing games and start treating this like a war. The implications hit both of them simultaneously. Morrison's midnight visit hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment intimidation attempt. It had been reconnaissance, an assessment of their opposition's capabilities and defenses. Now that they knew Silas's background, the rules of engagement would change dramatically. "We need to get you into protective custody," Sarah said urgently. "Federal marshals, safe house, the full program. These people have killed before, and now they have every reason to see you as an existential threat to their operation." But Silas was already shaking his head. "Won't work. Safe houses are for witnesses who can hide until trial. I'm not just a witness. I'm the only person who knows where Jake Hartwell hid his evidence, and Brimstone's the only living creature who witnessed the murders. They can't let either of us survive long enough to testify." As if understanding the conversation, Brimstone moved to the cabin window and began studying the approaches to their mountain sanctuary with renewed intensity. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly protective over the past hour, his instincts apparently alerting him to threats that hadn't yet materialized. "There's something else," Sarah said reluctantly. "When I ran your background check, it sent automatic notifications to several federal databases. If Morrison has contacts in local law enforcement, and we know he does, they might have ways to access that information." The full scope of their situation became clear with devastating certainty. Not only did the Morrison family now know they were facing a professionally trained opponent, they also knew that federal authorities were actively investigating their operations. The window for quiet elimination of witnesses was closing rapidly. "How long before they move against us?" Silas asked. "Based on their pattern of behavior? Soon. Probably within the next 24 hours. They can't afford to let this investigation proceed." Sarah stood and began packing her files. "I'm calling for immediate federal protection and an emergency warrant for Morrison's arrest." "Federal protection takes time to arrange," Silas pointed out. "Emergency warrants take time to process. How much time do we have before your backup arrives?" Sarah's expression confirmed his worst fears. "Minimum 6 hours for a tactical team to reach this location. Possibly longer given the remote terrain and weather conditions. 6 hours against an enemy who had just learned they were facing a trained killer instead of a frightened hermit. Against people who had successfully murdered entire families and covered up their crimes for decades. But as Silas considered their tactical situation, something unexpected happened. For the first time in 15 years, the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that had driven him into isolation began to lift. He'd left the military because he'd grown tired of violence, tired of the endless cycle of conflict and casualties that defined modern warfare. But this wasn't about politics or ideology or competing national interests. This was about justice for a murdered family. This was about protecting an innocent animal who'd waited 15 years for someone to hear his testimony. This was about standing up to bullies who'd used fear and violence to terrorize an entire region. This was exactly the kind of fight that had drawn him to military service in the first place, before the moral complexities of modern warfare had worn down his idealism. "Sarah," he said quietly, "you need to understand something. I didn't just specialize in asymmetric warfare. I was one of the best at it. My unit wrote the manual on how small forces defeat larger ones using superior tactics and terrain advantage." She looked at him with new understanding. "You're not planning to run, are you? This is my territory. I've spent 15 years learning every trail, every defensive position, every natural choke point within 10 miles of this cabin. Brimstone knows this land even better than I do." Silas moved to his gun cabinet and began selecting weapons with the methodical precision of a professional soldier. "Morrison's made 2 critical mistakes. First, he's given me advance warning. of his intentions. Second, he's chosen to fight me on ground that favors the defender. Brimstone had moved to stand beside the weapons cabinet, his amber eyes bright with intelligence and anticipation. The dog seemed to understand that their quiet days of investigation and evidence-gathering were over. Now came the part that would require different skills, the kind of skills that had kept both of them alive when others had tried to kill them. "The federal cavalry is coming," Silas continued, "but they're 6 hours away. That means it's up to us to survive until help arrives. One old soldier, one combat-trained dog, and 15 years of preparation against however many men Morrison can field." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then began checking her own weapon with professional competence. "You're talking about a siege, about holding defensive positions against superior numbers until federal reinforcements can reach us. I'm talking about making them pay such a high price for attacking us that they'll wish they'd never heard the name Hartwell," Silas corrected. "I'm talking about ending 15 years of terror and murder in these mountains." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the peaks, promising the kind of weather that would make movement difficult for attackers, but familiar for defenders who knew the terrain. The mountain that had served as Silas's refuge was about to become his fortress. The war was coming home, and this time he was ready for it. The rifle Jake Hartwell had cached in the mountains 15 years earlier was a Winchester Model 70 in 30-06, meticulously maintained and wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected it from weather and time. Silas found it exactly where the young rancher's final diary entry had indicated, hidden beneath a cairn of stones that looked natural but had been carefully constructed to mark the location. Along with the rifle were 4 boxes of ammunition, a spotting scope, and a hand-drawn map showing defensive positions around what had once been Hartwell land. Jake had been preparing for a war he'd never lived to fight, but his preparations would serve the battle that was coming now. "He knew," Silas said, examining the carefully chosen firing positions marked on Jake's map. "He understood he was going to have to make a stand, and he picked his ground accordingly." Brimstone sniffed the rifle case with interest, his amber eyes brightening as familiar scents triggered memories of the man who had trained him. The dog's reaction confirmed what Silas had begun to suspect. Rex hadn't just been a cattle dog. Jake Hartwell had been preparing his animal companion for combat as well as herding. Sarah Chen studied the tactical situation through her binoculars, scanning the approaches to Silas's mountain sanctuary as afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening. Storm clouds continued building over the peaks, promising the kind of weather that would limit visibility and make movement treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. "Morrison's made his first mistake," she observed. "He's giving us time to prepare instead of launching an immediate assault while we're still processing the intelligence about your military background." "He's not making a mistake," Silas corrected, checking the action on Jake's rifle with professional competence. "He's being methodical. Morrison survived and prospered for decades by planning his operations carefully. He won't attack until he's assembled sufficient force and developed a tactical plan." From their elevated position on the cabin's porch, they could see for miles in 3 directions. The 4th direction, directly behind the cabin, was protected by a steep cliff, face that would be impossible to climb in daylight, much less during a nighttime assault. Jake Hartwell had chosen his refuge well, and Silas had improved on those natural defenses over 15 years of unconscious preparation. The access road that wound up from the valley was the only practical approach for vehicles, and it could be easily blocked or monitored. The hiking trails that connected to neighboring properties were known to both Silas and Brimstone, giving the defenders intimate knowledge of every possible route an attack might take. "Federal Tactical Team is en route," Sarah reported after checking in with her superiors by satellite phone. "ETA is approximately 5 hours, weather permitting, but they're concerned about landing helicopters in mountain conditions if this storm develops as predicted." 5 hours. against an enemy who had already demonstrated willingness to kill entire families and who now understood they were facing an existential threat to their decades-long criminal operation. Silas moved through his cabin with the systematic efficiency of a soldier preparing for combat. Extra ammunition went into tactical pouches that he hadn't worn in 15 years, but which still fit like familiar uniforms. Night vision equipment that he'd brought home from his final deployment was retrieved from storage and checked for functionality. Defensive positions that he'd unconsciously prepared during years of mountain living were reinforced and supplied. "You really have been preparing for this," Sarah observed, watching him work with the smooth professionalism of someone for whom violence was a technical problem to be solved rather than an emotional crisis to be endured. "Not consciously," Silas admitted, "but old habits die hard. I spent 3 decades learning to think tactically about survival. Even when I was trying to forget those skills, muscle memory kept applying them to this environment." Brimstone had assumed a position near the main window where he could observe all approaches to their sanctuary. The dog's behavior had shifted from protective alertness to something approaching operational readiness. Ears forward, muscles tense, breathing controlled. Whatever training Jake Hartwell had provided was reasserting itself in response to the approaching threat. As evening approached, Silas made final preparations that drew on both military training and mountain wisdom accumulated over 15 years of solitary living. Solar-powered motion sensors were positioned along likely approach routes. Tripwires connected to acoustic alarms were strung across secondary trails. Emergency supplies were cached in multiple locations in case they had to abandon the cabin for more defensible positions. Most importantly, he established communication protocols with Sarah's federal support team and created fallback positions where they could retreat if the cabin became untenable. "The key to defensive warfare," he explained as they worked, "is making the enemy pay a higher price than they're willing to accept for whatever they're trying to achieve. Morrison wants us dead because we threaten his criminal operation. But if killing us costs him too many men, too much exposure, or too much law enforcement attention, he might decide we're more dangerous dead than alive." "You're talking about deterrence through superior firepower," Sarah said. "I'm talking about deterrence through superior tactics applied to favorable terrain," Silas corrected. "Morrison has more men and probably more weapons, but we have better position, better intelligence, and most importantly, better motivation." As if to emphasize his point, Brimstone rose from his observation post and padded to where Jake Hartwell's old rifle lay beside its cache of ammunition. The dog placed one massive paw on the weapon's stock and looked directly at Silas, with an expression that transcended normal animal communication. The message was clear. They were fighting not just for their own survival, but for justice for a family that had been murdered 15 years ago and forgotten by everyone, except a loyal dog who had waited patiently for someone to hear his testimony. The first sign of Morrison's approach came just as full darkness settled over the mountains. Brimstone's ears swiveled toward the valley road, and his low growl indicated movement too distant for human senses to detect. Minutes later, Silas's motion sensors began registering multiple contacts moving slowly up the access road with their headlights extinguished. "Here they come," Sarah whispered, settling into position behind the sandbags Silas had improvised from feed sacks filled with earth. Through night vision scopes, they could see at least 6 vehicles making their way carefully up the mountain track. The lead vehicle stopped frequently, probably to check for obstacles or defensive positions, while the others maintained formation at intervals that suggested military-style tactical movement. "Morrison's brought serious firepower," Silas observed, counting personnel as they deployed from their vehicles at the tree line. "At least 20 men, possibly more. Professional equipment, coordinated movement patterns. These aren't ranch hands playing soldier. These are people with military or law enforcement training." The implications were sobering. Morrison had apparently decided that eliminating 2 witnesses was important enough to risk a major confrontation with federal authorities. Either he had powerful protection that he believed would shield him from consequences, or he understood that allowing Silas and Brimstone to testify would destroy everything he'd built over decades of murder and intimidation. "They're not just trying to silence us," Sarah said, reaching the same conclusion. "They're fighting for the survival of their entire operation. That makes them extremely dangerous." Silas checked his weapons one final time and settled into the firing position he'd selected during their afternoon preparations. Jake Hartwell's rifle felt familiar in his hands, despite the 15 years since he'd last engaged human targets. Some skills, once learned thoroughly, never truly disappeared. Beside him, Brimstone had assumed a crouch that positioned him to move quickly in any direction while maintaining visual contact with all approaches to their position. The dog's breathing was controlled, his muscles coiled with potential energy, his amber eyes reflecting starlight with predatory intensity. "Federal backup?" Silas asked quietly. "Still 4 hours out minimum," Sarah replied. "We're on our own until dawn." 4 hours of darkness against 20 or more attackers who had killed before and were fighting to protect decades of criminal profits. The odds were challenging, but not impossible for defenders who knew their terrain and had prepared carefully for exactly this scenario. As Morrison's forces completed their deployment and began moving toward predetermined assault positions, Silas found himself thinking not about survival probabilities or tactical advantages, but about the fundamental justice of their situation. Jake Hartwell had died trying to protect his family's land from people who believed violence was an acceptable tool for acquiring what they wanted. Maria Hartwell had died because she'd refused to be intimidated into abandoning her daughter's inheritance. Their infant child had died because she'd been inconvenient to people who measured human life against property values. Rex, now Brimstone, had survived 15 years in the wilderness, carrying the memory of that injustice and waiting for someone who would listen to what he was trying to tell them. Tonight, finally, accounts would be settled. The dog would have his justice, the Hartwell family would have their vindication, and the reign of terror that had gripped these mountains for decades would end. All they had to do was survive until federal reinforcements could arrive to make the arrests and process the evidence that would put the Morrison family away forever. In the darkness below, Morrison's assault teams began their final approach to positions from which they would launch their attack on the mountain sanctuary where truth and justice had taken refuge, with a soldier, a federal agent, and a dog who remembered everything. The battle for the soul of the Montana mountains was about to begin. The combat knife had been with Silas since his first deployment to Afghanistan 28 years ago. Its blade was still razor-sharp, despite countless sharpenings, and its weight, in his hand, brought back muscle memories he'd tried to forget but could never quite abandon. Now, as Morrison's assault teams began their final approach through the mountain darkness, the knife represented more than just a weapon. It was a connection to the soldier he'd been before war had taught him the true cost of violence. The attack began with probing movements designed to test their defenses and identify firing positions. Dark shapes moved between the trees at the edge of the clearing, testing approaches while staying beyond effective rifle range. Silas watched through his night vision scope as Morrison's men demonstrated the kind of tactical patience that confirmed. These weren't amateur thugs, but experienced operators. "Professional reconnaissance," he whispered to Sarah, who was monitoring different approaches through her own optics. "They're mapping our defensive positions before committing to a main assault." Brimstone lay pressed against the cabin wall beside Silas's position, his massive frame tense with controlled energy. The dog's amber eyes tracked movement in the darkness with supernatural precision, his nose working to process scent information that enhanced what their technology could detect. The first real probe came from the northeast, where a team of 3, Men attempted to work their way up the access road under cover of the storm clouds that had finally begun delivering the promised weather. Rain started as a light mist that would soon develop into the kind of mountain downpour that could turn defensive advantages into survival nightmares. Silas let them advance to within 200 yards before engaging. The first shot from Jake, Hartwell's rifle, took down the lead man with the precision that had earned him sniper qualifications decades earlier. The other two immediately sought cover, but their muzzle flashes when they returned fire revealed their positions clearly through night vision optics. "Northeast approach neutralized," Silas reported quietly, already shifting to cover the next likely avenue of attack. But Morrison's teams were learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics to account for their opponent's capabilities. The next probe came from two directions simultaneously, a classic pincer movement designed to divide defensive fire and create opportunities for breakthrough. Sarah engaged the western approach with controlled bursts from her service weapon, forcing attackers to seek cover while Silas dealt with movement from the south. The coordination between federal agent and former ranger developed naturally, each covering the other's sectors while maintaining situational awareness of the larger tactical picture. Brimstone's contribution became apparent during the third assault wave, when Morrison's men attempted to use the worsening weather as cover for a closer approach. The dog's enhanced senses detected infiltrators that electronic sensors missed, his low growls directing defensive attention to threats before they could establish firing positions. "Contact 50 yards southeast," Silas whispered, following Brimstone's alert to spot two men attempting to work their way through the rocky outcropping that protected the cabin's right flank. The engagement was brief but decisive. Silas's military training reasserted itself with the smooth efficiency of deeply ingrained skills, placing precise shots that eliminated threats without wasting ammunition. But each successful defense revealed more about Morrison's resources and determination. "They're not backing off," Sarah observed during a brief lull in the fighting. "Most criminal organizations would cut their losses after taking casualties like this." "Morrison understands what's at stake," Silas replied, reloading with practiced efficiency. "If we survive to testify, his entire operation collapses. Everyone connected to 15 years of murder and land theft goes to prison for life." The rain was becoming heavier, turning the mountain clearing into a muddy battlefield that favored defenders who knew the terrain over attackers struggling with unfamiliar ground conditions. But it also meant that rescue helicopters would be unable to reach them until the storm passed, extending their window of vulnerability. Morrison's next escalation came in the form of concentrated fire designed to suppress their defensive positions. While assault teams maneuvered for close-range attacks, multiple rifles opened up simultaneously, forcing Silas and Sarah to keep their heads down, while attackers rushed forward under covering fire. This was the moment Brimstone had been waiting for. As enemy fighters reached the edge of the clearing, the massive dog erupted from concealment with the explosive power of an animal trained for combat operations. His first target, a man carrying what appeared to be grenades, went down with a scream that cut through the sound of gunfire and rain. The psychological impact of a 140-pound attack dog appearing from nowhere in a nighttime firefight was devastating to Morrison's assault teams. Men who had been advancing with professional coordination suddenly found themselves dealing with a predator that moved through darkness like a living shadow. Silas used the confusion created by Brimstone's attack to shift position and engage targets that had been pinned down by their defensive fire. His combat knife became essential when one of Morrison's men broke through their perimeter and reached the cabin porch, the blade ending the threat with the silent efficiency that had served him in countless close-quarters encounters. "Federal. Backup. ETA 3 hours," Sarah reported during another brief pause in the fighting, her voice tight with the stress of sustained combat. 3 hours. Against an enemy that was learning their tactics and adapting with each assault wave. The storm showed no signs of letting up, which meant they were truly on their own until dawn brought both clear weather and federal reinforcements. But Morrison's casualties were mounting faster than his ability to replace them, and his tactical options were being steadily eliminated by defenders who had turned their mountain sanctuary into a killing ground for anyone foolish enough to attack prepared positions. The knife in Silas's hand was no longer just a tool. It had become a symbol of his transformation from peaceful hermit back to the warrior he'd once been, fighting not for conquest or ideology, but for simple justice and the right of witnesses to tell their stories without fear of death. The metal dog tag that hung from Brimstone's collar caught starlight as he positioned himself between Silas and the two Morrison gunmen who had finally breached their defensive perimeter. Engraved with Rex, Jake's best friend, the tag had been hidden beneath his thick fur for 15 years, but now it swung free, a declaration of identity and purpose as the final confrontation began. Chet Morrison himself had come for this last assault, abandoning the tactical coordination that had marked his earlier attacks in favor of a desperate personal vendetta. The aging rancher moved through the storm-lashed clearing with the determined stride of a man who understood that failure meant the destruction of everything he'd built through decades of murder and intimidation. "Should have minded your own business, old man," Morrison shouted over the wind and rain, his rifle trained on the cabin where Silas had taken cover behind overturned furniture. "That dog should have died 15 years ago, and you should have let sleeping secrets lie." The admission was exactly what Sarah needed for her federal case. Morrison confessing to the Hartwell murders while multiple recording devices captured every word. But confessions wouldn't matter if none of them survived to present the evidence. In court, Silas assessed the tactical situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 3 decades of combat operations. Morrison had brought his remaining men, maybe 6 survivors, from what had started as a 20-man assault force for this final push. They were positioned to prevent escape while their leader attempted to end the siege through direct confrontation. But Morrison had made a crucial error in bringing the fight to close quarters. Night vision and superior firepower were less important when combat devolved to room-to-room fighting, where experience, training, and desperate motivation determined outcomes. "Rex was a witness to what you did to the Hartwell family," Silas called. Back, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command under pressure. "He remembered everything, Morrison, every detail of how you murdered that young family for their land." "That dog's just an animal," Morrison snarled, but his words carried the undertone of a man trying to convince himself as much as his opponents. "Animals can't testify in court." "Maybe not." Sarah's voice cut through the storm from her position covering the cabin's rear approaches. "But the evidence he led us to can. Jake Hartwell documented everything, Morrison. Every threat, every act of sabotage, every step of your conspiracy." The final assault began with Morrison's remaining men attempting to storm the cabin from multiple directions simultaneously. But their coordination had been shattered by hours of casualties and the psychological pressure of fighting opponents, who seemed to anticipate every tactical move. Brimstone met the first wave of attackers at the cabin's front entrance, his massive frame filling the doorway as he engaged 2 men with the ferocious efficiency of an animal trained for exactly this kind of combat. The dog's size and power, combined with the confined space that prevented his opponents from using their numerical advantage, turned the entrance into a killing ground. Silas engaged targets attempting to breach the cabin's windows with precise rifle shots that demonstrated why he'd earned sniper qualifications decades earlier. Each round found its target despite storm conditions and limited visibility, eliminating threats with the minimum expenditure of ammunition necessary for survival. The turning point came when Morrison himself attempted to flank their position by climbing onto the cabin's roof during the height of the storm. The aging rancher's desperation had overcome his tactical judgment, leaving him exposed and vulnerable when Silas emerged to meet him in direct confrontation. The fight on the storm-lashed roof was brief but decisive. Morrison's younger legs were offset by Silas's superior training and the mountain conditioning that had kept him fit despite his age. When Morrison's rifle was lost to a gust of wind that sent it clattering into the darkness, the confrontation came down to the kind of close-quarters combat that Silas had mastered in places far more dangerous than Montana mountainsides. But it was Brimstone who delivered the decisive moment. As Morrison pulled a backup weapon and prepared to shoot Silas at point-blank range, the massive dog launched himself upward with impossible agility, his jaws closing on Morrison's gun arm with the bone-crushing power that had once been trained to stop cattle, but had been refined by 15 years of wilderness survival. Morrison's scream cut through the storm as he tumbled from the roof, landing hard on the rocky ground below. When Silas climbed down to check on him, the rancher was conscious but clearly finished. His shooting arm mangled, his ribs probably broken, his weather-beaten face finally showing the fear that his victims had lived with for decades. "It's over," Silas said quietly, retrieving Morrison's dropped weapon while Sarah secured the few surviving attackers who had surrendered once their leader fell. Brimstone padded over to where Morrison lay groaning in the mud, his amber eyes studying the man who had ordered the death of his original family 15 years earlier. For a moment, the dog's expression held something that transcended normal animal emotion, a recognition of justice finally served, of loyalty finally rewarded, of patience finally vindicated. The metal tag on his collar caught the first hint of dawn breaking through the storm clouds as federal helicopters finally appeared over the mountain peaks, their searchlights cutting through the clearing rain to illuminate a battlefield where truth had triumphed over corruption, and a dog's 15-year vigil for justice had finally ended. Rex was going home at last, not to the ranch that had been stolen from his family, but to the peace that comes with seeing the guilty finally held accountable for their crimes. The new collar gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as Silas fastened it around his companion's thick neck. Brimstone was engraved in bold letters across the black leather, replacing the hidden identity that had been buried beneath matted fur for 15 years. No more Rex, no more ghost of a murdered family's past, just Brimstone, the mountain dog who had helped bring justice to the high country. 3 months had passed since the night Morrison's criminal empire had collapsed in gunfire and storm on the mountainside. The federal trials were proceeding with the methodical efficiency that Sarah Chen had promised, built on evidence that stretched back decades and included the testimony of a dog who had waited patiently for someone to understand what he was trying to tell them. Silas sat on his cabin porch, watching Brimstone explore their property with the relaxed confidence of an animal no longer carrying the weight of unfinished business. The dog moved differently now, less like a creature expecting attack, and more like a companion enjoying the simple pleasures of mountain life. His amber eyes still held their intelligence and alertness, but the desperate edge of a survivor living with trauma had finally softened into something approaching peace. "You're looking better too," Sarah observed, settling into the chair beside him with the easy familiarity of someone who had become a regular visitor to their mountain sanctuary. Less like a man hiding from the world and more like someone who's found his place in it. Silas had to admit she was right. The crushing isolation that had driven him to these mountains 15 years earlier had lifted gradually over the months since their confrontation with Morrison's forces. Having a purpose beyond simple survival, protecting Brimstone, pursuing justice for the Hartwell family, testifying in federal court, had reconnected him to the world in ways he hadn't expected. "The community's different now," he said, gesturing toward the valley below where Copperstone sat peacefully in the afternoon light. "People aren't afraid anymore. Ranchers are reporting crimes instead of accepting them as inevitable. Young families are moving into the area instead of leaving for safer places." The Morrison trials had revealed the full scope of a criminal enterprise that had terrorized the region for over 2 decades. Beyond the Hartwell murders, Federal investigators had uncovered evidence of cattle theft, insurance fraud, witness intimidation, and at least 3 other suspicious deaths connected to property disputes. The removal of that pervasive threat had allowed an entire community to exhale after decades of holding its breath. Jake Hartwell would be proud, Sarah said, watching Brimstone chase a butterfly through the meadow grass with the undignified enthusiasm of a puppy, despite his size and age. His family finally got their justice, and his dog found a home with someone who understands his worth. The Hartwell Memorial had been dedicated the previous month on the site where their ranch house had once stood. The community had raised funds to create a small park with historical markers telling the story of a young family who had died defending their land from criminal predation. At the center of the memorial stood a bronze statue of a cattle dog, Rex, as he had been known in life, immortalized as a symbol of loyalty and perseverance. Brimstone had attended the dedication ceremony with dignified composure, accepting the attention of hundreds of people who had come to honor the memory of his original family. Children had petted him gently while their parents explained how this remarkable animal had helped solve one of the region's greatest mysteries. He had seemed to understand the significance of the moment, sitting quietly beside the statue that captured his likeness in bronze. The federal prosecutor says Morrison will never see the outside of a prison again, Sarah continued. Life sentence without parole for multiple counts of murder, plus federal charges for the conspiracy and civil rights violations. His sons got 30 years each. The whole organization is finished. Silas nodded, feeling a satisfaction that went deeper than simple revenge. Justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about restoration, about giving voice to victims who had been silenced and ensuring that their stories would be remembered. "What's next for you?" Sarah asked. "The government's grateful enough for your cooperation that they'd probably help you relocate anywhere you want. Fresh start, new identity, complete protection." But Silas was already shaking his head. "This is home," he said simply, "for both of us. We've got roots here now, purpose. Besides, these mountains need someone to keep an eye on things. Make sure nothing like the Morrison situation ever happens again." The unofficial role had developed. Naturally, over the months since the trials began, ranchers throughout the region had begun calling on Silas when they encountered problems that local law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't handle. His reputation as the man who had brought down the Morrison Empire, combined with his military background and intimate knowledge of mountain country, made him a natural mediator and protector for people who had lived too long without effective protection. It wasn't the retirement he had planned when he'd first climbed into these mountains seeking solitude, but it was the purpose he had needed without realizing it, a way to use his skills for protection rather than destruction, for community rather than conquest. As evening approached and Sarah prepared to leave for her drive back to town, Brimstone returned from his explorations and settled onto the porch beside Silas's chair. The dog's massive head found its familiar resting place on his human's knee, and for a moment the afternoon was filled with the kind of peaceful silence that had once felt empty, but now felt complete. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, and Silas understood she was speaking to both of them. "For your courage, your testimony, your willingness to stand up when it mattered. The whole region is safer because of what you two accomplished." After she left, Silas and Brimstone remained on the porch as the sun tracked across the western peaks. The view was the same one they'd shared through countless evenings, but everything had changed. The mountains no longer felt like a refuge. From the world's complications, they felt like home, a place where two unlikely companions had found purpose in each other's company. "We did good, boy," Silas said quietly, his weathered hand finding the soft spot behind Brimstone's ears. "Jake and Maria and little Annie can rest easy now. Justice finally caught up with the people who hurt them." Brimstone's tail wagged once, gesture of agreement and contentment that said everything that needed saying between two souls who had found their way home at last.